The Soviet-Afghan War raged for 9 years and is considered a major part of the overarching Cold War between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union. A major faction in this war was the Afghan Mujahideen, the Islamist resistance groups that fought against the Soviets and the Republic of Afghanistan, backed by the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Iran, and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, all of whom had waged war against the communist Afghanistan government after it had seized power in 1978 on the back of a coup. The Soviet-Afghan War led to the deaths of around 3 million Afghans, while refugees fled to Pakistan and Iran. As much as 11.5% of Afghanistan's population was killed during the conflict, sometimes referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In this episode, we will explore the battle for Hill 3234, which took place just 1 year before the end of the Soviet-Afghan War in January of 1988. This battle saw members of the Soviet Union, supported by the Republic of Afghanistan, attacked by over 200 Mujahideen rebels and Pakistani mercenaries. The resulting conflict would see over 200 Mujahideen dead in a single day. Welcome to Wars of the World. After the 1978 coup, Afghanistan entered a state of near civil war. The country's new president was murdered by a rival, who took over his leadership. Afterwards, the Soviet Union became involved when they deployed members of their military who entered Kabul, killed the new president, and appointed a Soviet loyalist to take over. In November 1987, the Soviet 40th Army began Operation Magistral, a military operation hatched by the Soviets and the Afghan president Mohammad Najibullah to take back Satu Kandav Pass from the Mujahideen. The pass was just one of many old mountainside roadways that had been taken over by rebel forces during the 1980s and led to the city of Khost, along the Pakistan border. It was the only way by land into the city. Since it was controlled by the Mujahideen, it could not be used by the government or by the Soviets, who were forced to bring supplies in by air, something that was not only costly, but also risky, as rebel forces were now armed with weapons that could take down helicopters and other aircraft. Operation Magistral was put into place after talks with the Mujahideen had failed, as did negotiations with the local Jadran tribe, largely due to the determination of Jalaluddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, who were part of the rebel forces involved in the conflict. Reportedly, Haqqani wished to secure Khost as the center of his own independent Afghan state, and had no interest in backing down to the Soviets and the communist government. In 2008, it emerged that Haqqani was also an asset of the CIA, receiving tens of millions of dollars in cash for his part in the Soviet-Afghan War, and was even dubbed by one congressman, Charlie Wilson, as "goodness personified." Following the dissolution of negotiations, Operation Magistral was put into play. The operation involved various units from the Soviet military, including the 108th and 201st Motor Rifle Divisions, the 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment, the 56th Separate Air Assault Brigade, and the 103rd Guards Airborne Division. These units were supported by 5 infantry divisions and a tank division of the Afghan government. The Mujahideen were very well kitted out, surrounded by minefields and armed with anti-aircraft weapons, rocket launchers, RPGs, and heavy machine guns, meaning that any direct attack on their position would effectively be a suicide mission. To counteract this, on October 28th, just a few weeks before they launched their attack, the Soviets tossed uniformed mannequins from the air into Mujahideen-controlled areas, allowing a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft to transmit coordinates of their position to the Air Force. In the following 4 hours, the Mujahideen were subjected to a brutal onslaught of airstrikes and artillery assaults. The 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment, described as a veteran unit that had been in all sorts of raids and operations since the beginning of the conflict, was ordered to occupy the heights in the southwest of the pass near Sarani. The 345 set out to ambush the Mujahideen supply routes, their assault swift and aggressive, eventually leading the unit to be spread out across the mountaintops. 39 paratroopers of the 9th Company, who were part of the 345, were subsequently sent to Hill 3234, named for its height in meters. Soviet commanders saw the hill as a critical area to be secured and held. The 9th Company set up camp on the hilltop on December 31st, 1987. Many of the Mujahideen had fled across the Pakistan border following the initial assault in order to regroup and re-strategize. However, shortly after the Soviets had secured Hill 3234, the Mujahideen had started making their way back to Satu Kandav Pass, ready to reclaim it. To protect themselves from any future onslaught, and because they couldn't dig trenches because the ground was frozen solid, the paratroopers of the 9th Company began building waist-high walls of dry stone. However, they were also acutely aware that they were not prepared for a heavy attack response. Though they had a single grenade launcher and a few rocket launchers, they had only limited fields of fire. Still, the pass was secured, at least for the time being, and the Gardey coast route was open for travelers for the first time since 1981. In the following days, the paratroopers became the subject of sniper and shell attacks, but it was nothing extreme or partially concerning. But then, on January 7th, 1988, around 3:30 PM, the assault grew worse. A barrage of intense weapon fire was sent the Soviets' way, with hundreds of mortar rounds and rockets raining down on the paratroopers and their camp, shattering the dry stone walls they just built a week earlier. Around 250 Mujahideen and hundreds of Pakistani Special Forces fighters participated in the siege against the Soviets and the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, attacking from 3 different directions. The Mujahideen were able to bounce between covers, and some even got within 200 meters of the outpost before they were spotted. Heavy machine gun fire from the paratroopers soon dispatched this particular group of rebel forces, and shortly afterwards, a member of the Soviet unit contacted headquarters and requested assistance, which they were given in terms of artillery support, ammunition, and reinforcements. Eventually, helicopters would arrive to evacuate wounded soldiers. At 16:10 hours, another barrage began. Things had quietened down after artillery support for the Soviets had taken out some of the Mujahideen rocket launchers, but it was short-lived. The assault came from 2 different directions and was reportedly a much better planned and coordinated attack than normal. The Mujahideen were equipped with walkie-talkies, and they waited until the paratroopers ducked away for cover before moving forward as if they were militarily trained. They tossed grenades against the remaining dry stone walls, leading to the injuries of several Soviet soldiers, and before long, they were attacking the Soviets' heavy machine gun, which was unprotected, and stopping the Mujahideen from moving forwards. The gunner was finally stopped by shrapnel. The third attack came at 17:35 hours. The Mujahideen sprung out from 3 different directions, free to move now that the gunner had been taken out. Though the Soviets responded with artillery fire, the rebel forces were now noticeably nearer than they had been before, making it difficult to attack them with heavy weapons. The Mujahideen demanded that the Soviets give in, but they refused. Less than 2 hours later, at 19:10 hours, the Soviets were still fighting, but they were acutely aware that they were running low on resources, and did all they could to keep the rebels at bay, even engaging in hand-to-hand combat. As the night drew on, the Soviets requested further supplies from their leadership, but were told it was too dangerous for helicopters to be sent in, though eventually, a unit working further down the valley was ordered by their commanding officer to help. It wasn't easy though, given how steep Hill 3234 was and how heavy their supplies were. Their steps were slow and careful. The Soviets, meanwhile, continued to fight back at the Mujahideen. 2.5 hours after the backup unit had started its ascent up Hill 3234, it had reached the top. The unit helped their fellow soldiers stave off the remaining attacks by the Mujahideen, who, despite their efforts, were never able to secure the hilltop or force the Soviets to surrender. Of the 39 paratroopers who'd set up camp on Hill 3234, only 6 were killed in action, and 28 were wounded. In comparison, the exact number of Mujahideen killed in the fight is unclear, but estimates are around the 200 mark. Shortly before Operation Magistral began, the Soviets had planned to remove their forces from Afghanistan. They had reportedly never planned to stay in the country for long, but had offered to support its government as it adjusted to communist leadership. The Soviets also wanted to flatten rebel forces until Afghanistan was able to fend for itself. However, little effort was made to deal with the source of the problem, so rebels continued to emerge no matter how many of the Mujahideen were slaughtered. The Soviet Union began withdrawing from Afghanistan between May 1988 and February 1989, which would eventually mean that the battle for Hill 3234 was all in vain. Though Operation Magistral was deemed a success, Satu Kandav Pass did not remain open for long. Just a few weeks after the Soviets had secured it, they withdrew their forces and the Afghan army succumbed to attacks by the Mujahideen. By late January 1988, just weeks after the battle, the Mujahideen had recaptured the area.